Hi everybody, hope you're well. Today I will read from a book titled Non-Finito, The Cloisters of Saint Peter in Reggio Emilia by Zamboni Associati Architettura, published by Quodlibet. José Ignacio Linazasoro wrote, "The restoration of historical buildings has become increasingly frequent in European cities. For some time now, an attempt has been made to regulate these interventions in order to avoid any excesses and to safeguard the historical buildings themselves. Nonetheless, there is still a lot of confusion to this regard, and so, in this short text, I will try to make several important points. First, I would like to distinguish what I consider to be restoration from what can instead be defined an intervention on a pre-existing building. I am referring to the fact that although both instances conceptually refer to actions on pre-existing buildings, they have different purposes. Restoration exclusively means restoring a building that has been damaged over time without making any functional changes to it. The first restoration as such, starting from the 19th century, were conducted on buildings that were still being used, mostly churches and cathedrals. Nonetheless, the purpose of the work went beyond the mere repair of the damaged elements, since the intention was to restore an ideal prototype, reconstructing the missing elements. This was the aim of the restoration work conducted by Viollet-le-Duc and his followers in France and in most European countries. Buildings were not intended to be the result of a series of works carried out over time. On the contrary, it was a question of restoring stylistic unity, even though it had never existed, and therefore all the elements that had been added over time had to be eliminated. These approaches were later criticized, and what prevailed in the end was an understanding of historical buildings as aesthetic palimpsests, where one could recognize the different building phases that had to be valorized and restored. At the same time, stylistic reconstructions were criticized, ones that sought to restore what was presumed to be an original prototype, as Viollet-le-Duc and most 19th century restorers believed. It is true, nonetheless, that in the 19th century there was also a current that was against the Viollet-le-Duc conception of restoration. This current was represented by John Ruskin, although his romantic stance, contrary to Violet's rationalism, focused on the evolution of the ruin and time's effect on it. In this sense, Ruskin was against restoration and cannot even be seen as a model of modern restoration. The issue currently emerges when it is not a question of restoring, but rather of working on a building in order to provide it with a sense that differs from the original one, or of intervening on a ruin. When this is the case, the matter is highly complex, since it generally involves both restoration in the sense of the recovery of the impaired elements and the addition of the elements needed to allow a new use for the building. Until the 19th century, this type of work was common, and in such cases, what was done reflected the architectural viewpoint of the times. Nonetheless, the 19th century restoration theories eventually and logically influenced these types of actions, which we could qualify as interventions, because they do not solely concern the restoration, strictly speaking. In the attempt to avoid confusion between the added and the pre-existing elements, a great deal of emphasis was placed on the need to establish a contrast between what was new and what pre-existed, which led to many deplorable interventions, ones that were and are far removed from any type of synthesis and adequacy. This was also the result of poorly understood legislative imperatives that did not take into account the most basic of architectural principles. In this sense, of greater relevance are the reflections of Igor Stravinsky, even though they refer to musical composition, concerning the defense of harmony as compared with contrast, which does not mean continuity or the imitation of antiquity, but rather the search for a totality that can prevent the fragmentation of the building's composition. In many cases, the declarations made by Ambrogio Annoni still provide a valid reference. In the early 20th century, he defended the mastery of the pre-existing building, of the monument to be restored, as a model to follow in an intervention that should always be conducted on a case-by-case basis. The latter point of view, added to the search for harmony versus contrast, albeit clearly differentiating the original parts from the ones added on, seem to be the most convincing points of view in terms of support from the moment that one intervenes in projects such as these. Another aspect that is no less important and that is directly correlated with the other two here is that of the consideration and, to a certain extent, the specificity of opting for specific techniques of intervention. The recovery of artisanal techniques with which historical buildings were made, many of which by now abandoned, such as the stucco work or the masonry, are often inescapable, even though we cannot fall into a certain virtuosity in their use. Nor must they exclude, without discussion, other types of contemporary technologies or materials that allow for the engendering of a dialogue between the techniques used in the past and the ones used today. However, all this does not imply trying to juxtapose them. In the complex project for the Cloisters of Saint Peter, we find numerous particular cases of work done along the lines that we are defending. Note, first of all, that we were intervening on a work of extremely great architectural value, the work of one of the masters of the Second Renaissance, namely Giulio Romano, a work that had remained incomplete. Nor was the final state that had been planned for the most important cloister known. On the other hand, in the course of time, a series of constructions of negligible value were added to the original work of unquestionable value, as often occurs, especially when the building ceased to be a monastery and was converted into an army barracks. This made it hard to understand the whole and, first and foremost, the original building, as well as its conversion to a contemporary function. Hence, making it again usable and valorizing it requires several interventions that ranged from the demolition of these constructions and their replacement with other, more worthy ones, always framed by a contemporary but discreet language suited to the scale, to other types of works closer to restoration in what corresponded to the building as designed by Giulio Romano, albeit with no intention of completing it, but rather of maintaining its unfinished nature. The clarity and the rigor with which all these operations were carried out appears to be exemplary, in the sense that they allowed for the restoration of a patrimony of great value for architectural history, not just at a local level. At the same time, they have given the city of Reggio Emilia a large-scale place in which to celebrate events which will no doubt contribute to the city's cultural enrichment. Ask for the book at your local bookstore. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video. Bye.